Hello, welcome, Miran Karapte. Um, my name is Betsy Hasagawa, and I serve as the Associate Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at South Seattle College. And as is our habit here, our protocol here, I use she, her, and hers pronouns. And I come from Ainu and Japanese people. So Ainu are the first people of Japan, and we have an inseparable relationship to the land and have been targeted by settler colonialism in parallel with other First People, Native people, Indigenous people, and Aboriginal people around the world. And as human beings, we have all lived with the land, and we are right now occupying land that has been cared for since time immemorial by the first people onward. And they took up very seriously the charge from the Creator to care for the lands, water, air, and all the plants and creatures, and to honor the spirit of the lands, to keep everything in good shape for everyone for now and into the future. So our Seattle colleges are on lands that have been cared for by the many Coast Salish people of the Salish Seas, and we give honor, respect, and gratitude to them, past, present, and future, including the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Muckleshoot, and many, many other people who currently have and will live, trade, and pass through these lands. We acknowledge that our colleges are sited on these lands because of broken treaties and forced removal. And for this Day of Remembrance event, I particularly want to acknowledge that there is a complex relationship that resulted in World War II concentration camps for Japanese American citizens getting built on already stolen tribal lands. During this Black History Month, I also want to thank and honor the many members of the Black community who stood up for us and recognized our incarceration as an act of racism rather than national safety. Iairekere, thank you. I also want to give thanks to the Day of Remembrance organizing group from the three colleges. You all know who you are. And to our excellent, awesome Zoom hosts, Jacob Chin from Central and Christy Santos from North. And to Ken Matsudaira for emceeing us. And Ken did not introduce himself, so he'll do that in a moment. And to our speakers, Tommy Keita, thank you for being here. To our own Paul Kurose at North, and to Hamdi Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us. And my deep gratitude to my beloved fellow Associate Vice Presidents for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Brother DeAndre Fisher from North and Dr. Valerie Hunt from Central for their enduring support and partnership. Iairekere, thank you. And now I have the tremendous honor, privilege, and delight to get to introduce you to our first speaker and the first voice I ever heard, literally. My mother, Anna Sakaizawa Hasagawa, is many things. She is a lifelong educator, literally teaching all ages from early childhood to graduate students. Anna has also been for all my life an activist, a civil rights activist, a peace and anti-war activist, and a human rights activist. Anna has always been a glass half full kind of person with a positive and compassionate perspective about life and people and life in general. Everything was and is about growth and learning. Growing up in Chicago, our schools did not teach us about the experience of Japanese Americans during World War II. As a young one, I eventually discovered Japanese American author Yoshiko Uchida's stories about life in internment camps, as they were then called. When I asked my mother, "Mom, did you know about this?" I was astounded to find out that this was, in fact, her own experience as a teen. That started me on a lifelong journey to understand and appreciate the deeper roots of my mother's activism, her resilience, and our own family history. So I continue to be inspired by Anna's deep sense of dignity, justice, integrity, and humanity. I love her stories, and I love her. And I'm so pleased that you'll get to experience a little bit of Anna today as well. So thank you, Mom, thank you, Anna, and to my sister Ellen and Carol, who's also up there. They're tech supporting and arranging, Mom. So Iairekere, thank you all. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. And here's Anna. Thank you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to be here. By the way, this background is typical barracks at the Jerome Relocation Center, like those that we lived in. But first, some background. My father was a Japanese language teacher as well as a Methodist minister. And my mother was a trained early childhood teacher, although she was not teaching at the time. My sister May was 17, my brother Johnny was 16, and we all three attended the Polytechnic High School in Long Beach, California. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, our family gathered around the radio, listening with absolute horror. We couldn't understand why Japan would do such a thing, and we hoped people would not associate us with the enemy. I don't remember any specific racist acts directed toward us, but I'm sure there were dirty looks and snide remarks. But I do remember one high school teacher who gave me a hug and expressed how sorry she was that this had happened. So when Executive Order 9066 was issued on February 19, we had about 2 weeks to get ready to evacuate, even though we had done nothing wrong. Instructions were that we could only bring what we could physically carry. So you can imagine this limiting time resulted in huge losses for many families, such as their farms, businesses, or properties. So as we were frantically trying to decide what to do with our car and our furniture and our books, there was a knock on the door and two tall, polite FBI agents came to whisk my father away, and they would only repeat it was for security reasons. That made no sense. My father was a pacifist besides being a minister and an outspoken supporter of this country because as an 18-year-old, he had fled from Japan because of social and military pressures. My mother, who had always depended heavily on my father, found it hard to function, so that it fell to us three teenagers to take matters into our own hands and begin making decisions. You can imagine we grew up in a hurry. One of the untold stories is about ordinary people who stepped up to help the Japanese. For example, we rented an apartment from a Black family, and they told us that we could store anything we had to leave behind in their garage, and they would guard it for us until we returned. We were so grateful. Somehow we were able to be ready when the roundup crew came to pick us up. And I remember it as having been Palm Sunday because as we drove by our church, I remember thinking, we should be in there worshiping together. We were loaded onto a bus, and then I will never forget the chill running down my back when we got off the bus and we had to walk between two lines of armed soldiers to enter the Santa Anita Racetrack's Assembly Center. For the first time, I realized that we were truly prisoners. We were housed in horse stalls that had been cleaned out, and in a few days later, I remember sitting in the cold bleachers at the racetracks, perhaps 200 or 300 of us, and thinking, what a strange place to be worshiping on Easter morning as a prisoner in my own country. My father, who had been apprehended in March, was returned to our family in June after having been held at a detention facility for political prisoners in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Then in October, our family was transported by train to the Jerome Relocation Center in Denson, Arkansas. As I recall, it took us about 5 days, and we were cautioned to keep the shades down for safety precaution. But of course, many of us took many peeks from here and there. Jerome looked like a military camp with barracks, soldiers, barbed wire fencing. But by then we were used to living in this type of confinement. We had just one room for our family of 5. We sprung up sheets to provide a bit of privacy. We had a potbelly stove, some chairs, a table, and 5 cots. But with poor insulation, we were sometimes hot and sometimes cold. Of course, privacy between neighbors was a problem. I'll never forget the horror I experienced the first time I heard our neighbors arguing out loud. But not everything about living in the camp was bad. For example, our high school, with a population of perhaps 500 or 600 kids, provided me with opportunities for experiencing leadership that most likely would not have happened back at Polytech in Long Beach because of the thousands of students. For example, I was able to work on the school newspaper, serve as a yearbook editor, play my violin in the orchestra, join many clubs, and even serve as student council secretary. Well, as we neared graduation, I was awarded a full 4-year scholarship by the Presbyterian Church to Maryville College in Tennessee, arranged by my former Sunday school teacher back in Long Beach. I will be forever grateful to her. At Maryville College, faculty members frequently took me to different religious and civic organizations, including Knoxville College, a historic Black college, to talk about the Japanese experience during World War II. I found that most folks living far away from the West Coast had no idea about the Japanese incarceration. After the war ended, my family settled in Chicago, Illinois, where I joined them after graduation. There, I met my husband, raised a family, enjoyed a career in education, and so forth. But that's another story. I will end by underscoring that my purpose in telling my personal story is to point out that all of this unjust imprisonment actually happened in our so-called democratic country, and to remind you that all of us have a responsibility to speak out and make sure that it never happens again to anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your experience with us and setting up the whole context for the panel that we're going to be presenting. For those of you in the audience, if you have questions for Anna for later on, please feel free to put those into the chat. You can direct message to Jacob and he will activate cameras and mics later on during the during the question and answer period so that you can communicate your questions directly to Anna or the panelists. So it is my extreme pleasure to be part of putting together this panel of activists to talk about the legacies of Executive Order 9066, the internment order, and how history, memory, and solidarity are so important towards struggles for social justice, both in the past and in contemporary times. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Paul Kurose, who is a instructor at North Seattle College and a local activist. We have Hamdi Mohammed, who is a policy advisor with the King County Council for Equity and, oh, I always mess this up, Equity and Justice, is that correct?
Office of Equity and Social Justice.
Equity is Social Justice. Thank you very much. And finally, Tom Ikeda, who is our, who is the executive director of the Densho Project, a nationally recognized oral history and project that preserves the history of the Japanese American experience. So if I'd like to invite you all to the panelists to go ahead and say a little bit about their organizations and what are the sorts of things that you do in your work. And can we start off with Paul?
Good afternoon. I don't teach at North Seattle College. I also teach part-time over at Seattle University. I'm a longtime educator, taught high school for years in Oakland, California, and here in Central and South Seattle. And I got into education to serve the students of our community. And within these organizations, we still have a lot to accomplish in getting to the point where we're equitably serving all the students that we serve. And that's what I work to do within the organization I'm working in.
Thank you, Paul. Hamdi, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here with all of you. My name is Hamdi Mohammed. My pronouns are she and her. I work for the Office of Equity and Social Justice at King County as a policy advisor. I advise on the county's $12 billion budget and am working to help reduce the disparities in our county and advance equity at all levels in the county. And prior to that, I was working for Congresswoman Jayapal as her deputy district director, and working directly with constituents and supporting our small businesses, our communities that are impacted by the aviation industry, and also I have served as her campaign manager and worked with her when she was at One America as well. I would like to also share with this group that I'm very proud of our Office of Equity and Social Justice. We have newly formed a coalition against hate and bias. This is a group that formed right around when the pandemic hit and we were seeing increased attack on our Asian American community. And this coalition has been addressing a number of some of our most pressing issues in our community around hate and bias. And yeah, again, thank you for inviting me here, and I'm excited to share my story with all of you.
Thank you so much, Hamdi. And finally, Tom, if you could please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your activism.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So my name's Tom Ikeda, and I'm the founding executive director of Densho. We started Densho 25 years ago to simply be the collector and keeper of the stories of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. I was kind of moved, just listening to Anna's, recounting of her life, and we've collected over 1,000 in-depth oral histories of people talking about, how their lives were, changed, because of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. And the simple idea that we had at Densho was, let's video record these testimonies and then place them online so that everyone in the world can see this, so that we wouldn't be able to turn away from the impact of when injustice happens to a people, not because they did something wrong, but because of the way they looked or where they came from. And with these stories, and this is the part that I think inspires us who work at Densho, is to connect these stories to the injustices happening today, so that we can really promote equity and justice for all of us, not just the few who are in power situations. And so this is, as many of you are here for, a work of passion, and I'm so happy to be here and excited to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for setting up a perfect segue into the first question for the panel I'd like to ask. Could you all comment on how knowledge of history helps to shape and inform your activism, particularly in resistance to racism and for resilience and resistance?
I'll go ahead and start, Ken, with that, because I've essentially been collecting history and I've thought about this, and I had an interesting conversation earlier this week. It was another day of remembrance session that I had with the civil rights lawyer Dale Minami, who headed some of the cases during the 80s to get the government to apologize. But so this is his metaphor, but I love it, so I'm going to share it with you in terms of history. And what we talked about was how, in terms of the work we do in terms of activism and social work, is like climbing a mountain, and we're like halfway up the mountain. And when we look down in terms of the path we came up, what we can see is that how we stand really on the shoulders of the people who came before us. And for us to really acknowledge, I think, as a Japanese American, the debt of gratitude I have for, many in the African American community and others who really led the way in civil rights, and how, as we do our work today, it's because of the work that we can see that happened in the past. And that's kind of the history. And when I listen to the talk from Anna, how we also are on the shoulders of our ancestors and what they've taught us. But then our work isn't done by any means, and as we know today. And so as we're on this journey up the mountain, we look up the mountain and to see where we're trying to go, what we aspire to, and also recognizing that there's so much work. And to take this metaphor even further, how some of us, we can kind of follow people who are doing the heavy work and the clearing and the chopping to make the paths, but how we really want to be someone who's actually at the forefront, helping others, create new paths, and not doing it alone. We're a group. I mean, I see all the people here and how important this work is, and how meaningful it is for us to do it together. So that's in terms of the history and the activism. This metaphor of climbing the mountain together is something that I really kind of grasp to.
Thank you. Do you, Paul or Hamdi, do you want to jump in here and tell us a little bit about how history informs activism?
Absolutely, I can jump in. Similar to what Tom has said, we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? As those of us who identify ourselves as organizers, as community builders, as activists, history really does guide our work. And often we say never again. We said never again when it was the Chinese Exclusion Act. We said never again when it was the Muslim ban, right? And we say never again today as we remember those Japanese who were put in internment camps by our government. And we lead with that in mind, right? To ensure that we are putting protections in place for all of our community members, that we all deserve the right to exist, to live, and that our human rights should be protected. Everyone has human rights, and that's what we are fighting for. And for me, as even as a Black Muslim woman who has benefited from the civil rights movement, I think of the work that I've done with One America, the work that I do to engage my community, to participate in our system, right? To vote. There have been so many people, who have died for our rights to be able to vote, right? For us to have the Voting Act in place. And I always feel like I have a responsibility to make sure not only do I participate and make sure my family participates, but also that my community does too, and that they know that they have those powers, right? That's the beauty of being in this country, right? That there are systems in place, and that we all have rights, and that's what we are fighting for, is ensuring that everyone feels empowered to step into their power and to be able to participate, right? We all contribute to this society, we contribute to our economy, and really finding ways to making sure that our neighbors feel empowered to exist and to participate and to feel like they can make a difference, and the stories of Anna and other folks who have fought so hard to make sure that, we are able to, participate in our society is what inspires me. I feel like I have a responsibility to do that, right? And always feel like there's so many people who have sacrificed for me to exist. Not only just, my parents who, to me are the most resilient people I know, but I know that I'm also part of something bigger, right? That I'm part of a community that has been fighting for folks who look like myself to be able to have access to resources. And I recognize my privilege, and that really comes from understanding that history and that, having that context and knowing that, we are part of something bigger.
Thank you.
So,
Paul, do you have any other thoughts?
well, I was just going to say, so strategically, I was thinking, okay, I'll just let Tom and Hamdi speak, and then I can just say, yeah, like they said. And then I kind of messed up because now I have to speak after Hamdi. And I said, oh man, I have to come in after her. But there are a couple of things just to add. It's like when Anna was speaking and as she was finishing up, hearing her talk about those things that she experienced and thinking there are members of our community experiencing that right now. Mass incarceration, forced detention, family separation, racial profiling, religious profiling. And as Hamdi just said, I mean, never again. It's happening again, and we need to act now. We can't wait. We can't, those are our children, those are our people, and we can't allow it to happen or to continue to go on.
Excellent, thank you. As Paul was saying, a lot of Anna's experience that she had related to us is happening in contemporary times. Hamdi, I know that you were directly impacted by some similar circumstances. So could I ask you to please talk about your experiences after 9/11?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, as I was listening to Anna share her story, and towards the end, she said, we all have a responsibility to speak up, speak out to make sure it doesn't happen again. I share my personal story with folks in our community to make sure that people, that we feel empowered by our story. Because I think for a very long time, for me, sharing my story was almost like it's shameful. I said this to you guys. I used to think, the experience I had around 9/11 was un-American. I shouldn't share it. I should not speak on it. And as an immigrant, often you feel like you're living and learning in two different worlds, right? You have your cultural expectations in the house, and then you go out into the world and there's other sort of expectations that are out there. So as a kid, I always tried to find that balance and to find a blend of the two. And, I was I'm going to age myself. I was getting ready for 6th grade camp when 9/11 happened. And I remember sitting in my classroom and my teacher coming to my desk and saying that, your mom is on the phone and wants to talk to you. And that wasn't normal, right? Like my mom didn't call our school and ask to speak to me. Normally it was me calling my mom from the nurse's office and asking to go home because I wasn't feeling good. And that happens sometimes too often. And so this day was just different. She called and I got up and I immediately, for some reason, just kind of got worried. And I picked up the phone and she started asking me like these like specific questions, like, are you okay? How is your teachers treating you? Do you feel safe? Has somebody said anything to you? And as a kid, sometimes I would wear my hijab to school. I was, sometimes I didn't wear it. And so, that day I had my little scarf tied up and she's like, has anybody said anything to you? Have someone said something about your appearance? And it was just all really bizarre questions to me. And, and she kind of just said, like, it was towards the end of the day. And so she said, in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to pick you up and, see you in a little bit. And so 20 minutes later, I got in the car, we went home, and, the TV was on CNN and wasn't turned off. And we were seeing the planes hitting the Twin Towers. And, my mom was devastated by it. Everyone in the house was so sad. I mean, we clearly saw that our country was under attack. And my mom was saying that, and she was saying prayers. My mom is a very religious woman and a spiritual person. And so, she was praying for everyone who was in those buildings and for the firefighters that were, fighting. And, constantly there was just like prayers in the house and, saying all these like really positive things. And my mom was very worried that whole time as she was doing these things. And of course I was like, I didn't make the connection where her worries were really coming from. I just thought like we felt really bad about what just happened in the United States, this horrible, horrific attack. And that afternoon we went to the grocery store, and I feel like I'm getting emotional. We went to the grocery store and bought our groceries, and it was just me and my mother. And we got in the car, like as our way out of the grocery store, this gentleman, it was a really tall white guy, approached us, and he just started spilling out all sorts of racial slurs and screaming at my mom, screaming at me. And I was so like startled by it. It still impacts me till today. And I just remember just my mom saying, quickly get in the car, like, don't look, don't say anything. And we got in the car, and till today, I remember just like looking at the side of the window and just like trying to calculate what the heck was going on, like, being a kid, it didn't register to me like what was really happening and how that would like impact my family. And I was talking to someone recently, and they said, Hamdi, you came to the US when you were 3 years old. You are a native, right? My first memories are in the United States. I went to Springbrook Elementary School in Kent. And so I always felt like I belonged, right? Like, even if all the students in my classroom didn't look like me, I very much felt like I belonged. I was part of my student government. And so that was like an unbelievable moment for me, because at that moment, I felt like I didn't belong, right? I felt so different and out of place. And my mother was shaken by it. And in 2 days, I was going to 6th grade camp, and no one was going to stop me from going to 6th grade camp. And my mom was like, there is no way you're going to that camp with your teachers and all these random students. I just do not feel safe with you doing that, right? And we sat down, we had long conversations about it. I, explained to my mom how that guy wasn't like my teachers, and my teachers are so great. And it's not that experience doesn't define my school, is what I kept trying to explain to her. And I went back to school the next day, and I told my teachers what happened and what my experience was. And I just told them that my mom is devastated, and like, we got to do something, I was always a young person who was always like, we got to do something. So I like demanded that my teachers do something. And I was like, you guys have to do something. I have to go to 6th grade camp. If I don't go to 6th grade camp, I'm literally going to die, right? And luckily, I had incredible teachers, right? And today I even push for a more inclusive education system that is, and teachers who have a sense of equity, right? And teach with an equity lens, because those teachers really understood the cultural differences and what was going on, that they came to my house that night. They did not have to do that. 2 of my teachers showed up to our house, and they talked to my mother. They explained, what was going on, and how, our 6th grade camp was going to be like, and how, they could trust that I would be safe. They put additional measures to help her understand that, like, she would be able to call me, talk to me. They would check in with her. We had like 3 check-ins throughout the day. And they put all these different sort of measures around me to ensure that, my mom would trust that I would be safe. And I ended up going, and, I did talk to her, while we were at camp, but really that experience shapes who I am today, right? Like, that moment could have been for me a moment that for the rest of my life, I would have carried on this sense of not belonging, or the sense of like, I'm not an American, or that it would have an impact on me where I would always feel like, I couldn't participate, fully in show up like myself, and, teachers can impact a child's future, right? And as, Anna was telling that story, we have a responsibility to tell these stories for someone to hear it and to feel that connection, that we are all interconnected. And when we see injustice happening, or we see someone's rights being violated, that we speak up and do something about it, right? That we take action, right? And we try to find solutions to make a difference. And I carry that experience with me. When I was working for Congresswoman Jayapal, I was managing her constituent services team. And basically what we were doing is responding to community members that were being impacted by federal policies and agencies. It could be someone that was, stuck abroad, or it could be someone's, shipment not coming in, or an issue with the IRS. And literally, like, I would stay in the office X amount of hours if it was in, something that's happening overseas. Sometimes I would set my alarm to 3 o'clock in the morning, and to make those phone calls, and to ensure that that person, his rights weren't being violated, and that our federal government was acting appropriately. And it is, I'm able to do that and do my activism and my work because of that experience. And while it's still like, I'm still moved and I'm shaked up and I'll get teary telling that story, but it really is, it has helped me be who I am. And it is someone I'm proud of. I'm proud of who I am today, and, we just have to be able to be comfortable in telling our stories, in not being afraid to walk into our cultural, our histories, even our dark history, right? To step into that, and to make really dark moments, turn them into something that is powerful. And so I feel really grateful to be able to share with you all my story today. And I hope you guys find some inspiration from it, to take some action, and to do some work, and to speak up when you see, an injustice happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for blessing us with that story. Personally, I so much of what you said resonates with, kind of this unsaid sentiments that my family has carried, and leaks out sometimes in the retellings of stories from the internment camps. But it's thank you very much for that. I'd like to ask Tom if you could talk a little bit about some parallels that you see between Hamdi's stories and the stories from Japanese Americans in World War II, their experience there.
Yes, certainly. So Hamdi, let me just start by just saying, I'm so sorry that happened to you when you were so young. I mean, it's such a heart-wrenching story, and to thank you not only for sharing it now, but I know you share it with others, and your story of courage in the face of this, to to make social justice such a focus of your life because of some of the experiences you've had. But I want to touch upon actually the reaction of your mother, and because it struck me, her concern for you, because I remember 9/11, 2001. So it's about 20 years ago, and I was in the throes of doing quite a few interviews with Japanese Americans, and so I remember the days after 9/11 doing interviews with Japanese Americans. And these were elders who had, like Anna, lived through World War II. And during the conversations, everyone I interviewed that week, and there were 3 or 4, mentioned the same thing. When I asked them about what they were thinking about 9/11 and the impact of it, each one of them, the first thing they said was, I'm so worried about what's going to happen to Muslim Americans, the Arab American community. Because like your mother, they understood the system we live in, the racism, the fear, and they all knew that you and others who people would think are not American, are somehow different, that they're part of the enemy, that you would become a target. And there was this incredible fear that in the Japanese American community, this knowing, kind of like what your mother was concerned about. And that was when I heard your story, just really struck me, because from that, I'm taken back. And you mentioned Congresswoman Jayapal, because I remember she started Hate Free Zone right after 9/11, and we reached out and we talked with each other, and the importance of, or that connection of how much Japanese Americans, because of what we had gone through during World War II, our community, and what was going on now, how what happened to Japanese Americans wasn't an isolated event. It was part of this pattern in our country that gets repeated over and over and over again. And so, we threw our support behind, Pramila when she started Hate Free Zone, because we knew that, the power of the story, like what you just did, if we could also do that as Japanese Americans and share this, and to let people know that, again, this isn't isolated. This is something that's happening over and over again that we have to stop. And the pain and trauma and the post-traumatic stress that you put on these individuals and communities needs to be stopped. This was something we really, really wanted to work towards. So again, thank you so much for sharing your story and the courage you have to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I'd like to ask Paul if you could comment a little bit about what we can do to push back on racism that we saw during World War II, and also the racism that we're seeing today.
I think we have role models that have shown us what we can do. Back during the time, during World War II, when this was happening to our community, there were others who stepped up, who spoke out. Floyd Schmo from the Quakers. I actually just learned this a few years ago from Japan Public Television, that Floyd Schmo organized people to clean up anti-Japanese graffiti during that time. There was a picture of him with a crew out cleaning up anti-Japanese graffiti, as people were moving, like the Freeman family out in Bellevue with their anti-Japanese organizing that started long before World War II, as they were pushing for Japanese to be taken away. There were those in our community who stood up for Japanese Americans. Daisy Tibbs Dawson, later one of our neighbors in the Central District, somebody that my mom worked with and along with Seattle Community College District Board of Trustee member Dorothy Hollingsworth. They worked together starting up the Project Head Start in the Central District. So there were people who have come before us, who have shown us, have modeled, have made a difference, and we can look to them. Later, during the 60s, I'm very proud, I was asked actually to come speak at the Minidoka Pilgrimage. Minidoka was the concentration camp that most Japanese Americans from Seattle were incarcerated in. And I was asked to come to speak at the pilgrimage out there a few years ago to speak about something my brother Guy had done. And at first I kind of laughed because when my brother Guy joined the Panthers back in the late 60s, it wasn't something that the Japanese American community was saying, this is kind of behavior that we want our kids to see as model behavior. It wasn't the model minority that we are stereotyped to be. But my brother Guy, he saw injustice happening. He saw violent acts being taken against members of our community. We grew up in the Central District. And so he joined the Panthers along with his best friend, Aaron Dixon, who started the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party. And the Dixons started that chapter to defend the community. Frequently, the Black Panther Party gets mischaracterized. They were started to defend and serve the community. And that's what they did. And my brother saw that and he said, this is something we should be doing. So it's not just speaking out. It's not, when you see something, you don't just say something, you get out and do something. And I think we saw these people get out and do things. I'm proud of the fact that my brother Guy got out and did things. I'm proud of the fact that he and my sister, Ruth Ann, they went out around that same time. And as the FBI was raiding tribal lands, and an armed assault on tribal lands around fishing rights, my sister and brother were out there with the muckleshoot standing against them. And when I shared that with those at that pilgrimage a few years back, I said, you know, I'm glad you guys had me do this because it made me really think. And I really thought about it. I said, well, you know what Guy and Ruth Ann and family members did was pretty progressive, radical, whatever you want to label it. I thought, my parents backed them up. You know, my parents not only backed them up, but my parents are the ones who kind of taught us that was the way we needed to be. Those are the kinds of things we needed to do. And they did that through their actions. We saw them active in standing up against injustice in our community. And so it just seemed like, well, that's the thing to do. It's kind of like what Tom was saying earlier about the metaphor Dale Minami shared with him. And my son Kenji, who's on, I'm really happy, I said, but I'm nervous because he's here in the audience. But I've shared with him before this Gil Scott-Heron song that talks about not being too happy about the middle of the mountain. And soon we'll be climbing again. You gotta listen to the whole song, Tom. But it's really, and it says, because their lives inspired us, you know, and I think that's where it came from for us. And that's what we have to do for our youth. That's what Hamdi's doing. She's getting out there. She's speaking out. She's acting out. And when I met Hamdi, when we got together about this panel, and she mentioned that she had worked with One America, with Pramila. I said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. I said, that's what my family, we didn't look as being in solidarity with the African-American community. This was one community that we were a part of, and we saw these things happening to our community. And that's what I'm saying about the kids at the border who have been separated from their families, their parents. That's our community that's happening to. You know, the Muslim, and that's our community. These African Americans getting killed by the police, those are our community members, and we can't allow this to continue to happen to our community. You're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah. So one of the themes that all of you talked about, Anna, Paul, Tom, and Hamdi, has been about how we can support each other in our struggles for justice and equity. Could I ask the panel to talk a little bit about how we as organizations, institutions, and individuals can do this kind of work? What are some things that we should be looking, what are some strategies or methods that we can consider for increasing the way that we support each other and trying to make the world a more equitable and just place?
Tom, you're muted.
Tom, you muted?
Thank you, guys. So let me build upon something that I heard Paul say about we're all one community, and with that thinking, and Paul's family has been such a leader in this, but this concept of community organizing, as one community is so powerful, and I love what Paul said. Rather than talking about us as different communities coming together in solidarity, instead just thinking of us as one community and organizing together. In the last few years, especially because of the policies of the Trump administration, I've seen a lot more people coming out and organizing. Examples are, and Paul mentioned, the detention centers holding refugees are coming through the southern border. I mean, we have a large one in Tacoma, the Northwest Detention Center, and as Paul says, they are our community. And rather than just talking about it, getting people to actually not only know about this, but to go down there and to protest and to demand the release of people, and to keep the pressure on, not just as individuals, but as a community. So can you ask, so what can we do? I mean, it's I don't think it's rocket science. I think you're really kind of looking around, assessing what's going on in our communities and who's being hurt, and then taking action, figuring out what we can do. And not just talking about, but what's a specific thing we can do, and then start organizing, our collective community to make change. I think that's really powerful. There's, and going back to my conversation with Dale Minami earlier, we talked a lot about, it's also so much a matter of the heart. And when I listen to, particularly Hamdi and Paul, I can tell both of them are so much led by their hearts. And I think we all are. And we have to remember that when we talk about these things, to do it from a place of compassion. And it's not these people or, things happening to them. It's really us, and for us to feel it. And so, for us to remember that, because that's what's going to drive us. I mean, for some of us who have been doing this for decades, it's not because it's a good idea. It's because it really hits us in the heart. I mean, there was a mentor of mine. She was really involved with redress, Mako Nakagawa. And she always told me, because I can be a very cerebral kind of guy and think about things. And she always told me, and I'm getting this more in the last few years. She said, Tom, it really comes from the heart. And yeah, you can have all the reasons why it's wrong, but ultimately it's the heart, and to really share that. And that's why, again, I was so affected by Hamdi's sharing, because that really came from the heart. And I think I really felt that. So that's my take.
Thank you. Paul, Hamdi?
Yeah, I can chime in as well. Thank you, Paul and Tom. To just build on what you guys have already said, and I'm in complete agreement, right? And injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, right? It's that sense of feeling like we are this one community. And, I think about this last sort of election that happened. So many of us have celebrated. There's those who didn't. And in the end of it, I just feel like we still have a lot of work to do. There's folks who feel like, we have now have a change in administration, and somehow some of our issues are going to go away, or we might not have to show up in the streets like we were before. But I honestly think that that was just the first step towards creating the sort of just world that we want and deserve. And, you know, a world that we would be proud of leaving for the next generation, right? We are in the middle of a pandemic, and we have seen how it has disproportionately impacted communities of color, right? In our own region, even Tom's point about the Tacoma Detention Center, there's just so much that's happening even in our own backyards, right? In our own region. You look at right now, just the way that the pandemic has impacted our region, right? And areas like South King County, neighborhoods that are predominantly POC, right? Communities of color, how it has impacted. You think about climate and climate change. And sometimes we think that, you know, this is happening globally and it's something, you know, that's bigger than us, and these fights are bigger than us. And really, we can think of it even regionally, the wildfires that happened this summer, right? And the way that it impacted certain neighborhoods, cities like SeaTac and Kent. These are areas that are now becoming majority minority communities, right? The air quality was worse in those areas, you know? And so there is just a lot of work that we have ahead of us. And we have to be able to, you know, find our role. And I think when you do activism or you're a community organizer or builder, someone said to me recently, like, you're so ambitious, you have all this drive, and you know that somehow is going to change later. And really, it's like it's knowing that there is just so much at stake. That is what motivates me, is I know that there's just so much at stake right now, and I'm trying to do whatever I can to do that, right? And so that's what everyone should be doing. You can't be at every single place. You cannot, everyone has their own sort of responsibility. So many of us in our communities are working 2 or 3 jobs, and really it's just finding whatever you have the capacity to do, but to do something and to take action, right? For us to think about system changing, right? And for those of us who work in governments or institutions, really pushing our institutions and governments to think more broadly, right? Not just having one grant or, you know, this one thing to address this one solution, but really thinking, you know, systemically, like, how do we change these things to ensure that, you know, my grandchildren are not going to have that problem. They'll have other problems to deal with, but not this one, right? And so that is what we are striving to do. And I really just encourage people to find just a thing to do. I've had friends in the tech industry, and they're like, well, I don't know where my place is in the social justice or activism work that you do. And it's like, there's so much happening online, right? There is so much action that, you know, that is taking place there. And the movement also needs, you know, tech support, right? I have aunties who are like, I don't even read, I can't read, you know, what you're putting out, or I don't understand this, right? But I'll cook food for you is what they say to me. They're like, if you have an event, you know, call on me to make some food. The movement needs food as well, right? So it's like, there's a place for everyone, and all of us can contribute and do something. And we should never feel like we don't have a place in that. And every sort of action you take matters. And I commend everyone who is out there trying to make a difference.
Thank you, Hamdi and Tom. Hamdi brought up Kent, and when she brought that up, we're in the Seattle College District. You don't have to go out to Kent to see these things happening. We have to take a look at ourselves, and we have to be honest with ourselves. If people are offended by me saying this, that's just kind of makes my point even more strongly around the need for us to do more to truly show that we value diversity and inclusion. We need to start treating all kids all of our students, I say kids because I've been around for a while, some of them aren't kids, but we need to treat all of our students like they're our students, like they're our children. I have the privilege this quarter of taking a class from Deepa Bandaru at North, and I'm behind in my work, okay, but she's doing an amazing job teaching about injustice. And one of the things she brought up in that class was teaching about mass incarceration and what's happening in our legal system, and how there's this different treatment of members from some communities and others. How drug problems, drug addiction problems, drug use problems were dealt with by our criminal justice system when it was crack cocaine. And those who were seeing as having that crack cocaine problem were predominantly from the inner city. Now, that other cocaine that some people not in the inner city were using wasn't seen as being as much of a problem, but they criminalized the crack cocaine use. And so many are behind bars because of that. But then when it became an opioid problem and the people using these drugs were different, then it got dealt with differently. Then it was dealt with as a health issue, a mental health issue. And we dealt with it differently. In our district, we have the same problem. In our schools, we have the same problem. If they're your children, you don't expel them. You don't kick them out. You work with them. And when people speak up and point this out, they're not the problem. Unless you're not being real when you say you're committed to equity and inclusion. So we need to address this. We need to be honest about it within our system and not get defensive, not resort to retribution for those who do speak up, but thanking those who speak up and saying, you know, if you don't see it yourself, if you're truly committed to equity and inclusion, thanking those who are in our organization who are bringing that to your attention. And I think, you know, we got this Northwest thing about that doesn't happen here. It happens here. And we need to start dealing with that, addressing it, and being honest about it, because many are continuing to suffer as a result of this. I was so happy, Hamdi, to hear the end of that story of yours, because as you started telling that story, man, I was just like you were doing. I was cheering up thinking of my mom, because she was a senior at Garfield High School when, you know, and I thank Tom for this because Tom recorded her talking about it. And I got to hear her talk about going to school the next day after Pearl Harbor. And sadly, her experience wasn't yours in the schoolroom, in the classroom you were in. And many of our students still today in our Seattle College district don't have that experience that you had, Hamdi. They don't feel they belong. And we need to make sure that that comes to an end.
Thank you, Paul. I want to thank our panelists for this amazing discussion, this amazing dialogue that we've been having. Sincere gratitude for it. I want to open up for questions. If you have in the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and post them in chat to Jacob Chin, and he'll kind of do, you know, mission control to get you on mic and camera. But before we do that, and while people are thinking about these questions that they'd like to ask, are there any final last things that you'd like us to think about, panelists?
I just want to thank everyone, you know, for being here. And again, I just feel deep gratitude to be able to share space and to share stories and to hopefully inspire each other to do more. And so thank you. And thank you to the panelists as well.
I just want to echo what Hamdi's saying and thanking. And just maybe a historical note, we are celebrating the Day of Remembrance. And this is like a national day of remembering for the Japanese American community and what happened during World War II. And just as a historical note, the very first Day of Remembrance was in Seattle in 1978. And its origins were as a protest um, movement, to bring attention to what happened to Japanese Americans and to demand an apology and reparations from the government. And after in the 80s, after the government apologized and paid Japanese Americans $20,000 each who were there, the Day of Remembrance kind of shifted to more memorializing and educating. But what's interesting in the last few years is how the roots of Day of Remembrance has returned to it being more of a protest, and and I think it's the sign of the times, of where we're at, and things like, I know some of you are following like HR 40 in terms of having commission hearings about African American slavery and reparations for that. These are all things that we can get involved in, and so I just want, as a last thought, is be aware. I mean, find out what's going on. Follow people on Twitter and other social media that where things are happening, and then commit yourself to getting involved, because that's really the only thing that's going to make changes. If we just sit back, we are then, we say at Densho sometimes, silence is compliance, right? If we don't get involved, our silence is essentially acceptance in terms of what's going on in this country. So please, please get involved.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just want to point out, I was wondering if, Tom, if you were there at that first Day of Remembrance in Seattle. And I remember being there, and it was kind of, historically speaking, it was at Six Stadium. Some of you are too young to remember Six Stadium. It's where Lowe's Hardware is over in Rainier Valley. But we used to have a little semi-pro baseball stadium there. And that's where that Day of Remembrance program started. We met there in the parking lot. And then we had a caravan out to Puyallup, where there was a temporary detention center where Japanese Americans were taken before being taken to the concentration camps in the interior. But one piece that anybody who's received an email from me lately has seen is this symbol right here was created for that Day of Remembrance. And the person who created it was an art teacher at Seattle Central Community College at the time, Shobo Frank Fuji. And that symbol has definitely lived on and has become a symbol reminding us of the injustice. The first stripe, next two stripe, and then the following three stripes represent the three generations of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated. And it's surrounded by barbed wire. You can't see it too clearly, but so our district has connections to this movement, and our district needs to, again, continue to be involved, continue to take part in not just symbolism, but actually acting to make sure these things stop happening. Not never happen again, because they're happening, but we got to make them stop happening.
In fact, Seattle Central College was one of the sites where testimonies were taken during the reparations process. So our district has served as a historical site for much of the protest that has happened around us, around this event. So I'm going to try to post a resource list in the chat for additional things you can look up online. And Jacob's going to help me get that posted in just a second. But if we have some questions, Jacob, do you want to let us know who's got questions on deck?
Of course, give me one moment to scroll back up to our first question. So we can do this one of two ways. You can either request to ask the question yourself, or you can request that I ask the question for you. Either way is completely fine with us. These first two questions, both the questioners have asked that I read them out. So our first question is from Cristobal. What role do you think not having legal accountability for participants in acts like these has on similar injustices being repeated? I am particularly thinking of the concentration camps that developed along the border housing immigrant children, among other examples. So Kim, would you like me to read out the other questions as well, or do you want to first start with that one?
Panelists, would you like to start on that question first? Do you want to repeat the question, or?
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, could you repeat the question, please?
So the question from Cristobal is, what role do you think not having legal accountability for participants in acts like these has on similar injustices being repeated? I am particularly thinking of the concentration camps that developed along the border housing immigrant children, among other examples. And I will copy and paste the question into the chat.
I can take a stab at it. I haven't read it fully, but I think accountability, like taking legal obligation and accountability, is really important, right? And I think this points to what Paul and Tom was saying, even about reparations for our African American brothers and sisters. You know, when our government does something wrong, right? And whether it's active violence or putting out executive orders or anything that, you know, is harming our community, there needs to be accountability, and we need to make sure that those issues do not go unaddressed, and our democracy and our government is supposed to serve the people, right? We are our democracy and have the power to shift things, and so we have to be able to call those things out and take actions to make changes around that.
Yeah, thanks for posting it. I wasn't quite sure what the question was, but yeah, unless there's accountability, it just keeps repeating. And you know, a good way of answering this is, it reminded me of a story. Henry Miyatake, who was one of the early organizers in Seattle to demand redress from the government that happened in the 1980s. But he was a Boeing engineer, a brilliant Boeing engineer. And for those of you who know Seattle history, back in the 70s, Boeing canceled this large program called the SST program, and they laid off a lot of people, and that's when they had the big billboards, with the last person in Seattle, please turn the lights off. And at Boeing, because Henry was such a brilliant engineer, they didn't fire him, but instead they cut his pay in half. And Henry complained to his white manager, saying, how can you do this? I'm so valuable. And the white manager said, well, I know what happened during World War II. And Henry, you were placed in a concentration camp along with your other, the rest of your community, and nothing happened. No one complained, or you guys, it just happened, and you let it happen. And so I know that if we treat Japanese Americans that way, that you're not going to do anything. And when Henry recognized that unless there was some accountability, these things would happen over and over again, something had to be done. And so he led this early movement to demand redress, knowing that unless Japanese Americans and others stood up to these injustices and demanded accountability, it would just happen over and over and over again. So that's why it's just so important that we do that.
I'd like to add, in addition to, what was it, legal accountability, I think we also have to have professional accountability as well within these organizations in which we're working, where we express our commitment to equity and social justice. And then we're okay with acts of inequity and social injustice. So we need to hold ourselves accountable. People do need to be held legally accountable for their acts, and not just some people, okay? Because that's what we've seen, the law and order party. They're not so much for law and order when the leader is committing crimes. So we need to all be accountable. And we also need to make sure that those who are being responsible are supported as well. My younger sister, I'm really proud of her that she's now leading some work around workforce education in Seattle. But for years, she struggled trying to serve members of the community. And within her work, she's had to really battle to get where she's gotten. And I hope her taking stands for those who others aren't taking stands for, that she's supported in that work. And I think those in our organization who take stands for those who others aren't supporting need to be supported in this work. So I think they're both accountability and responsibility that needs to take place.
Thank you. Jacob, are there other questions?
Yes, there are. Our next question is, sorry, I've had to scroll all the way back up to find them. Our next question is, are there any other, from Renee? The question is, are there any other Day of Remembrance activities that the panelists could recommend? And as I'm posting that into the chat, I've also been getting messages from other people within the meeting, including Ken himself, who have listed out different links. But if there's any that the panelists could think of that haven't already been addressed, or maybe have not already been addressed, we just haven't had a chance to open up yet.
So other Day of Remembrance resources that you can think of at the top of your head, or events that are happening?
On the DENCHO website, we have a listing of various DOR or Day of Remembrance activities. One that we're already halfway through the week, so I'm thinking of all the ones that are already done. But there is an action happening at the Northwest Detention Center on Sunday at 1 p.m. And there will be a car caravan starting from the Puyallup Assembly Center. It's the Puyallup Fairgrounds, and a caravan going to the Northwest Detention Center. And so that's an action that people can participate, and they get more information if you go to the DENCHO website. So that's one if people are interested.
DENSHO.org for the website.
Great. Thanks, Ken.
Are there other questions? And yes, we will be, there are links and resources being posted in chat right now for additional resources, video, links to DENCHO and other organizations that are doing memory work. So please check that out if you haven't accessed them already. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, got it. Our next question comes from Tracy Lai. She was asking, she'd like to hear more about how we can counteract the polarization and misinformation that divides people. Whoopsies. Sorry, once it switches over. So I just posted the question in the chat.
I mean, that's a big one. I
Yes,
mean,
I know that's,
it's kind of like I mean that hits so much of our country. Uh, and actually, Tracy, I know you. You're probably a good one to answer that. You should probably come online and share your thoughts in terms of what you think should happen. I mean, it's been so discouraging. I mean, it seems so clearly evident what people are doing and this misinformation that's just so blatant, and yet so many people in our country believe it. I mean, these lies, like the election fraud for existence. I mean, what else can you do? You just make it so clear, and yet so many people struggle with this. So I I struggle with this too, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts and the thoughts of the other panelists and what we can do.
Yeah, yeah, like you said, it's a heavy question, and I think it is one that we are constantly working at to address. And I think our leadership plays a big role, right? Like those who we put in positions of power, and that's whether we are participating in the system or not participating, right? Like when we have people who are in office and are there representing our communities and then pushing propaganda, misinformation, really makes all of our work and lives so much harder, right? I think about this pandemic, and I've been working at the county and responding to COVID-19. I've been part of the COVID-19 response team, and just like the misinformation around the virus in itself and the attack on the Asian community and the Chinese community has just been like, I want to say unbelievable, but it is very believable because our history tells us, right? We've seen it repeating itself. And so we are constantly trying to figure out how to address that, and how do we get accurate information out. And really it takes all of us doing our part, right? We are living in an era where now even misinformation can spread so quickly, right? Social media immediately can get information out there, and it is so hard to control it, and to be able to speak facts and get the truth out there has been even more challenging. I think about our vaccine and the information that's out there around it, and the sort of misinformation that has been spread about that, and how communities who have been impacted the most are now afraid of it, and I think a lot, there's a lot of intention behind that, and we all have to really work at trying to do our parts, but it's a heavy question. And if I could think of any sort of words of encouragement or anything like that for the folks who are on this call, it's really paying attention to what's happening locally and in our own areas, and making sure that we are protecting each other, our neighbors, and our community, and showing up for each other, and working hard to get accurate information out into the community. I remember when COVID happened, and we were noticing people in our own community saying, I'm not going to go get tested in a van in this neighborhood. What we started doing is partnering with our local CBOs, and having the testing vans come to their locations and test folks there, right? And it really it started changing behavior. And I went from having calls where people were like, COVID is not real, or something like that, or I'm scared to do it, or this and that, or I read this article, to I saw this van at our local community organization, like, who was testing them, and like, what kind of testing is it? How does the swab happen, and things like that. And so we just have to all really work hard in getting accurate information out there and doing our part.
Thank you.
I appreciate what Hamdi was saying. I actually appreciate everything Hamdi's been saying, but thank you, Hamdi. But one of the things, maybe it's because I'm a math teacher. Okay, I was going to try not to talk about any math this whole time, but I can't help myself. It's not my truth that 2 + 2 is 4. I don't own that truth. I don't own the truth. There is no your truth and my truth. I don't get that one. Now there's your perspective and my perspective, okay? But we got to start recognizing there's truth and there are facts. There's alternative facts, your truth, my truth. That, you know, no such thing. And so I think that's a tough question, Tracy. And, you know, all I can think of is I got to do like my dad. My dad, when I was a kid, we went to Sonics game. Back then, they used to get up and say the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of the game. They did. I got ready to get up. My dad didn't let me. We sat. And as everybody else said the pledge, later on, my dad said, I can do it. I can't put my hand over my heart and say with liberty and justice for all. So this was back in like 68, 69, before Colin Kaepernick, before Mahmoud Rauf in the late 90s. But my dad wasn't into telling a lie with his hand over his heart. And we just need to speak the truth. That's all we can do to counteract the misinformation. I can't get other people to stop lying, but I can get myself to tell the truth. The polarization, big problem. We see it happening in our inner cities, some of the stuff that's taking place with Asian elderly. And I was looking at it and I said, oh, I guess I am one, right? So I gotta look out for these Asian elderly. But that is a result of things having changed where we don't see each other as being one community. And so I think, you know, in the power that I have the power to make a difference in how I look at things and how I talk to my son about things, how we look at everybody as being our community. And then I think the more people start practicing that, then the less of a problem it will be.
Thank you, everybody. So we're at the end of our program. In fact, we're about 3 minutes over, but I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Special thanks to our panelists, Paul, Tom, Hamdi. A huge thank you to Anna for leading us into this fascinating and important discussion. I'd like to thank the committee for the Day of Remembrance Organizing Committee, Yuki Tamura, Teresa Yamada, Tracy Lai, Paul Kurose, Monica Lundberg, Melanie King, Kathy Whitnam, Jacob Chen, and Betsy Hasagawa. And I'd also like to thank all of you who attended this, and especially I'd like to give a shout out to all of those who came before us, who make our struggles for social justice happen. A couple quick announcements. Oh, sorry. We're opening up the chat to everybody right now. And what I'd love you to do, if you're able and you're willing, is if you experienced the camps yourselves, if you have family members who were interned, were taken away, please post their names in the chat. Acknowledge so that we can acknowledge them. Post their camps. Were they in Minidoka? Were they in Tule Lake? Were they in Jerome? Let's see. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you again. Oh, no, one more thing. We'd also like to acknowledge the Seattle College's Black community has some things going on for the District Black History Month. 1 week from today, Thursday, February 25th from 11 to 1, featuring South's Dr. Dan Johnson as keynote. Please look on, for those of you who are on district email, for email from Dr. Fisher with the Zoom link coming out. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And please go out there and do good in the world.
Thank you, Ken. And I forgot to say that I went to South Seattle Community College and Central. So shout out to everyone who's attending there.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And again, thank you, Hamdi and Tom, for coming and being with us in the College District.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
If we will also be saving these transcripts So we can definitely send them out to folk if they would like. Just shoot us an email, a message, and make sure that you leave a way for us to contact you, so that way we can send some of these transcripts out. Also, right now, just giving people a heads up, if you don't, the chat is open. I'm seeing some of you do direct messages to me. You just got to go onto the chat tab, and then click on the down box, drop down menu box, and select everyone in meeting.
And I'm going to ask Mom, Anna, could you please turn on your camera again?
Come on, Mom.
We want to see
There she
you.
is.
Thank you. Thank
Yay.
you.
Thank you so much, Anna. It was gorgeous. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Anna.
Anything you want to say? Just thank you all for what you're doing.